All right, looks like we have everyone who's here at the beginning. So we will honor those of you who are prompt and get started. Welcome to our webinar on strategic restructuring. I'm Suzanne Elliott. I'm with Envision Consulting. I'm going to start off by just letting everyone know that we are recording today's webinar and we will be sharing it with all the registered participants and posting it on our website afterwards. I'm, as I said, with Envision. For those of you who don't know us, I think most of you know Envision, but if you don't, we are a nonprofit consulting firm with our main office in Pasadena, but we also have an office in New York. We work with clients in Southern California, in New York, New Jersey, and across the country. And our services are executive search, leadership development, and strategy for nonprofits. And within that strategy space, we do quite a bit of work helping nonprofits navigate strategic restructuring, the exploration as well as the implementation of restructuring, including mergers, which is the term that most of us use most frequently, but there are lots of different types of restructurings. And one thing we've found throughout our experience is there isn't a whole lot known in the nonprofit sector about the ins and outs of strategic restructuring. There are a lot of kind of questions and even a lot of myths about how it works and what doesn't. So last month we hosted a webinar, what we called our part 1 of strategic restructuring, with Carrie Harlow to talk from the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative, just lay the groundwork on this topic and talk about what is strategic restructuring. When is a good time to think about something like this? What are some keys to success and some challenges? And that was a great conversation, just with kind of those basics. And that webinar is available on our website, the recording as well as the slides. We'll also send it out after today as well for those of you who missed that part 1. But we definitely heard from all of you that there's a real interest in hearing some real stories, hearing from people who have walked this path in different capacities and can share what worked, maybe didn't work, and just reflections on experience. And so we put together this webinar with some really amazing people who are joining us as speakers today. So joining us today, we are really thrilled to have Wendy Carpenter, who is CEO of Penny Lane Centers, Lori Gangemi, who's with the CEO of AbilityFirst, and Sara Straubel, who's a program officer with the Ahmanson Foundation. And Ahmanson is one of the funders involved with the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative in LA. Also joining a little bit more in the background today, but still definitely here, is Carrie Harlow from NSI, who's going to be helping us with Q&A. So what we're going to do today is first give each of these amazing leaders an opportunity to share their experiences and perspectives on strategic restructuring, so what they've seen and experienced. And then I have some questions for them as the moderator. I'll take that role on. And then we'll end with questions from all of you. Questions you have about their specific experiences or more general questions. And I encourage you to put your questions as you think of them in the Q&A box. We'll keep track of them and we will definitely save time at the end to address questions. So let's dive in. And Wendy, let's start with you. If you could share your experience with strategic restructuring.
Thank you, Suzanne. So good morning, everybody. And it's a real honor to be on this panel with these other ladies. And just a little bit of a background. I've been with Penny Lane for, I hate to even say it, 30 years. Please don't do any kind of math in your head. But I just recently was appointed the CEO in January of this year. And I think part of the reason that I got this job, not only sticking around for 30 years, that does help, but because I did have the experience of doing a merger in 2013 as the second in command. And it was a smaller agency that was not too far from our headquarters. We're in the San Fernando Valley in North Hills. And it was an agency that was really struggling financially. And a lot of people kind of saw this agency as a way of really putting a feather in their cap if they were able to acquire this agency. They had a lot of land, they had a good reputation, and you know, it looked really great on paper. You know, I kind of stayed in the background a little bit. I wasn't up at the front, you know, saying, hey, look at us. But what we did do is we really formed a relationship with the people, and it was actually consultants who were managing the agency at this time, and just really talked about our philosophy at Penny Lane, what we believed in, what we could do for the agency. And we got our board members together pretty early on to kind of just meet and greet and feel more comfortable. Their board was really concerned financially for themselves, to be quite honest, because the agency was in a pretty desperate situation. And I think the board members saw, oh, you know, holy cow, if we don't do something, it's going to come back on us. And so we really tried to kind of address those concerns up front. And you know, I'm not saying that this was an easy process, because there is nothing easy about this. But we did go in pretty early, and we're pretty clear with everybody about what we were able to do for their agency. We met pretty quickly with all of their staff, and actually met with them individually just to kind of hear what they were feeling, what their experiences were, what they would like if the merger were successful. And then ultimately we did have a very successful merger about, you know, 12 years later. 12 years, felt like 12 years, 12 months later. And you know, looking back on it in 7 years, you know, it really gave me a lot of confidence, not only in myself, but in the power of relationships, and being honest and being transparent and being clear about what it is you can do for one another. And I will say now, as the CEO, I feel like there's nothing I can't do, because it really did allow us to do things in a different way, to be creative, to say this is the way it's going to look. And I'm happy to say too that part of the acquisition is we got a lot of land that we are now starting to build affordable housing on. We never would have been able to afford that land on our own. So that's kind of my experience in a nutshell.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Really interesting. And Lori, we're going to shift to you now. And in, you know, some ways, the structure of both of your agencies are similar, large agencies with a lot of government contracts. Your experience is more recent, though. So you could share how you've walked down this strategic restructuring path.
Sure. Thanks, Suzanne. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Yeah, we are still in our merger process, but it will be final on September 1. So we're at the very, very end of it. Started about 2 years ago. So I'm CEO of AbilityFirst, Lori Gangemi. If you don't know AbilityFirst, we've been around for about 90 years, but our former name was the Crippled Children's Society of Southern California. So we operate throughout Southern California, but we're headquartered in Pasadena. We have a lot of different variety of programs for children and adults for developmental disabilities. We do receive a lot of regional center funding from the state of California. So kind of a diversified program stream, but very heavily emphasis on employment. And so there is the organization we're merging with is FEO Solutions, which is also headquartered in Pasadena, when they do strictly employment for adults with developmental disabilities. And there was a big change, started I guess about 4 years ago with the government funding having to do with the employment program. And so we were both on this path simultaneously, not really, you know, talking to each other, but both kind of doing the same things to reinvent this program. And I think what happened is they realized being their only program, it wasn't going to be viable for them in the long run. Whereas we had a lot of different types of programs, and this is a very important one, but we were able to make the change a little bit easier. Yet they had a social enterprise, which was something that we weren't figuring out how we were going to be able to keep our social enterprise, and we wanted to. So it was a really good kind of strategic opportunity for both organizations, I think. And I think that's one thing that made it really important, was it was aligned with the strategic plan. So they approached us about 2 years ago, and I had never been through a merger. AbilityFirst had been through a merger about the time that I started, which was about 16 years ago, but not since then. So we jumped in and found the right consulting help, and Envision helped us with that, and then the grant with the NSI really got us off on the right path to really make it happen. So that's where we are, and it'll ask me in a couple weeks, but it'll be, they're telling me there's nothing that can't make it not happen now.
That's great. Thanks, Lori. Sarah, we're going to shift to a different perspective here. So from the private foundation perspective, and as a funder and a partner within NSI, we'd love to hear your perspective on all of this.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm Sara Straubel. I'm a program officer at the Ahmanson Foundation. I've been at the Ahmanson Foundation for 7 years now. I'm one of the 4 managing funders for NSI. We are a group of more than 18 funders, but 4 of us sort of take on more of like a leadership role. So I joined Jennifer Price-Lesher from the Ralph M. Parsons Foundation, Jen Venor from the Univet Health Foundation, and then Allah Ronan from the California Community Foundation. So we all serve as the managing funders. I took over from my colleague at the time, Carrie Harlow, who was at the Ahmanson Foundation. She took over from Lynn Alvarez. So when she left Ahmanson, to run NSI, I took over in her role. I have, in terms of my own experience, I've reviewed several organizations that have participated in strategic restructuring with support of NSI. To date, we've made about 242 grants, and so I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of those grantees in various stages of the process.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So let's get into some questions. So the first, I want to kind of start at a high level. And my first question is for Wendy and Lori, and maybe we can start with Wendy. I'd be curious to hear, when you started the merger exploration process, what were the goals? And, you know, now looking back a number of years, were those goals achieved? And was there anything unanticipated, like any unanticipated benefits that came out of it that maybe you didn't know going in?
So I would say, you know, the goal for all of us, right? We're all in kind of the helping and healing field, is it's got to make sense to your mission. It's got to make sense to help more youth and more families in our case. You know, we've always done residential, we've done foster care, we've done mental health, and we've done housing. So, you know, looking at another agency, it's got to be able to reach those people, either in a different location or with a different service. And so I would say the first thing is, you know, take a hard look at your own mission, and then take a hard look at the other agency's mission, and do these two cultures complement each other. I think a mistake would be, you know, kind of getting excited about, you know, going into a different location and thinking, holy cow, this is going to make our agency stronger or whatever. I think that's a mistake. Philosophically, it's got to make sense to you as the CEO, to the board, and to the other agency. You know, and that was the main goal for us, was to really expand our mental health contract. We were able to add a couple more group homes for probation and DCFS youth who needed that service. And it also got us a new contract, which was with the Department of Rehab, and helped us do some employment for some of our existing clients, which is something that we had dabbled with but didn't really have a funding stream for that. And so that was very exciting to us. And, you know, again, to be perfectly honest, what they had was land free and clear. They had no debt around that. And for us, we really saw that as an opportunity to have that land to be able to, you know, eventually develop some kind of housing or something that would help our kids and families. So I would say that, you know, we were pretty clear about what our goals were going in. And that agency was just really looking for, please help us. You know, we don't want to lose our staff. We don't want to lose the clients that we're already serving. You know, what can we do to save that portion of who we are? And so they were very clear about what their goals were too. So it just kind of meshed for us. You know, unanticipated benefits. Well, I was able to meet Matt and Allison, which was a wonderful thing to be able to know them. And it was kind of a little bit at the beginning of Envision. So it was really exciting to kind of have that as you know, kind of a starting off point, I think, kind of for both of us. And, you know, again, as far as our confidence level at Penny Lane, it really helped us to be able to look at things in a creative way and to look for ways to expand in some non-traditional ways.
Really interesting. Thanks, Wendy. Lori, I know it's premature to talk about goals being achieved, given where you are in the process. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about kind of what your goals are as you've gone through the exploration process, and kind of how are you thinking about them now as things are about to be finalized, you're about to move into really full implementation.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think Wendy said it very well. It's got to start with the mission. And so for us, we had gone through a strategic planning process fairly recently. So we kind of knew what, not only our mission, of course, but we knew our core programs and we had defined our core geography. So those were two things that were really important because we are kind of far flung in terms of geography and the types of programs, but we had honed in and we knew that Pasadena was the core geography and we knew that employment was a core program. So one of our main goals was to expand a core program and a core geography. And then just being able to offer a more robust employment options for our participants, especially as we were closing our work center, as I mentioned. We'd already created 3 new programs and options for them. And this was a very fourth exciting one, which was their social enterprise. So they actually do a manufacturing. And they have a contract with a national organization called AbilityFirst, where they do contracts for the federal government. So that was something that we had thought about trying to get into before, and it was kind of one of those things that seems like a lot of work. It's hard to break into. So this was a way to really acquire that, you know, that contract and that skill set that was needed for that. So those are 2 really important parts. I mean, no matter what, I know we will have achieved the expansion of a core program being employment in core geography. We'll see about the social enterprise because those are tough, and you probably could do a whole nother webinar on that. But you know, we are very hopeful that we'll be able to keep it going, and then it'll become a strong part of AbilityFirst as it was for FBO. And then our third goal, which is yet to be seen, which is really increasing our name recognition and our credibility as an organization. I think partly because of the name change, we're not very top of mind to a lot of people. And we're working on that because we think that will help us with fundraising and advocacy, and client recruitment, and staff recruitment was that's not as much of an issue today as it was 2 years ago, as you remember how hard it was to hire staff. So that was also part, and that fed into it too, was staff acquisition. That is part of that now because of COVID, that isn't necessarily our goal. And, you know, some of their staff have been furloughed, and unfortunately we're not going to be bringing them on, which was something we had kind of promised in the beginning, but, you know, it's just, you know, things change, especially when it goes on for a period of time. But I think everything else is definitely very doable and realistic. And so we're very excited about that. And, you know, as far as the other added benefit, I will agree, you know, the way Envision approached it, they started off with this whole comprehensive, we're going to tell you everything about AbilityFirst and where your strengths and weaknesses are. And we're like, really? Do we have to do that? You know, let's just get in and, you know, we want to hear about the other organization. But, you know, you do learn a lot, and it's kind of an added benefit to have that as you go along. So that was a nice added benefit.
Right. Something you both mentioned that I think, I mean, it is so important for everyone to keep in mind is the length of time that it really takes to, you know, fully explore. And then even once you decide, both sides decide, yes, let's move forward with whatever type of strategic restructuring, you know, just the legal side takes time, getting all of the details together. It takes time, and the world can sometimes change during that time. You can't just put everything on hold. You know, your organizations are still operating. Things outside your organization might change. And so I think you both kind of captured that you have these original goals. Sometimes those goals have to change. And sometimes you also have to kind of adjust what it's going to look like by the end. It's really true. Sara, I'd love to hear from you from a funder perspective. How do you think about success when you're looking at strategic restructurings?
Something that I think is great about NSI is that the success is in the organizations having the conversation. We remain agnostic on the outcome. For us, we see there's tremendous value in just engaging in the process, no matter what it yields. And it can look like a lot of different things. I think that there's some like very obvious ways that strategic restructuring can go, but they really range. So you could become sort of a fully integrated organization. There's mergers, there's parent subsidy relationships, there's asset transfers, there's joint venture partnerships. And then there's also shared service agreements. So this could be a co-location or sort of support in shared back office staffing or just back office consolidation or joint venture partnerships. And, you know, even in some cases, the creation of alliances or networks across multiple organizations. So we remain agnostic sort of on exactly what success looks like for organizations. But in terms of key factors of success for nonprofits that are engaged in strategic restructuring, you know, Wendy and Lori mentioned a lot of these, but I think it's worth repeating. We do a lot of data collection as well. And so we've observed that organizations have reported that successful negotiations had the time. You know, you mentioned this idea, you know, you have to devote a lot of time to the process and let the process sort of guide you. Organizations also, they've demonstrated internal clarity about what they hope to gain from the process. They engaged in very honest, upfront conversations with the partner organization or organizations that they're working with. And they had some, very often had some positive previous working experience with one another, so they had a sense of who they were. They had compatible missions, compatible cultures. This can sort of get to the staffing piece as well. And they also had a clear understanding of what the strategic restructuring process could look like. And, you know, I think this is really important, but they worked with a third-party consultant to help facilitate that process.
Thanks, Sara. So we're going to shift here to, I would say, like one of the questions we get asked most often when we're talking about strategic restructuring is around the financial side, you know, and often financial needs are one of the major reasons for organizations to consider strategic restructuring. I think once the process starts, other pieces come into play, as Lori and Wendy talked about, but often it is kind of that catalyst to start thinking down this road. And so one of the questions we're often asked is, well, what happens with funding, especially funding that maybe both organizations have, whether it's foundations or government contracts? You know, what can we expect in terms of what private and public funding might look like after a strategic restructuring, particularly after a merger, when there's that full consolidation? And Allison Fuller from Envision always says, and I love to quote her on this, when it comes to mergers, and you're thinking of funding, 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. Sometimes 1 + 1 = 1. Sometimes you talk to a foundation or other funders and hear, oh, well, you're joining forces. Oh, good. That means I don't have to do 2 grants. I can just do 1. And, you know, sometimes that still happens. So there's always a lot of questions around what could funding look like for us after a strategic restructuring. So Wendy and Lori, I'd like to get your thoughts on what you've seen. And for Lori, I know, again, you're early in the process, but so far what you've seen with private and public funding during and after a strategic restructuring. And Lori, maybe we can start with you this time.
Sure, yeah, so I can speak to, you know, what it's like when you're in that process and you're both still applying for grants, because of course we had a lot of talk about that because it, you know, wasn't public. We were very careful not to share the information widely, including with a lot of our staff until we got further along. But we would disclose it, that we're having some discussions and that kind of thing to try and be transparent with funders. Once it got announced and we had told all of the stakeholders, then the timing came. We had a shared funder that we both had applications into at the same time. Luckily, we didn't have a lot of overlap, but we had a couple and one happened to be at the same time. So we had a conversation with them. I think actually FBO had the conversation. And they came back to AbilityFirst, the funder, and said, okay, you need to decide if you want to withdraw yours or let theirs move forward. So it was kind of you pick which one you want to have funded. So that was a little unfortunate. It wasn't, I mean, it was, I think, maybe a $25,000. So it's definitely nothing to sneeze at, but it wasn't one of the, life-changing type grants. So that was one. But on the flip side, we've had, and I just got news today of a $10,000 grant that we're getting from an organization that we had never been involved with. And we had a call with them a couple months ago to let them know about the merger because they had supported FBO consistently. And it's a bank, so you always get that dreaded question about, well, do you have an account with us? Would you like an account with us? And so I thought, oh dear. But anyway, we got the $10,000 today. So I think, although I guess if you're looking at 1 + 1, it may still be 1, but to AbilityFirst, it's new money. So I think that, I view that as a win.
Absolutely. And Wendy, what has your experience been on the funding side?
So my one piece of advice would be is read your contracts before you get into the whole discussion with another agency. We had a couple of missteps, particularly with DCFS, and I think I was unaware that DCFS has to give its blessing before any merger can happen, particularly when it comes to group homes and foster homes and whatnot. So, we had not looped them in early enough. And so we did a lot of repair work around that. And, happily, we did not lose any funding, and we just kind of meshed the existing contracts together. So it did not, and same with Department of Mental Health. It worked out fine. We did, and we are still trying to repair that, did not talk to one of the contracts soon enough, and they were extremely angry and were very clear that our contract is with this other agency, not you. And so we really have spent close to 7 years trying to repair that relationship. So I think what Sara is saying is so important, is you've got to start these conversations early, particularly with your stakeholders and your funders. We did in the merger lose one donor that was right around, I want to say like $50,000 a year, which is, that's decent money. And it just was, they didn't know us. They didn't know Penny Lane, and we probably could have done a better job of engaging him. Yeah, I'd say start talking early with everybody that's significant and read your contracts so you know what people need to know up front. We're just in the process of engaging in maybe another merger situation, and I have learned those lessons, and I'm right now reaching out to everybody I can think of so we don't lose funding. And funding translates to services. That's why it's so significant.
Yeah, absolutely. Read those contracts, starting out very early. Absolutely. Sara, I have a kind of a twofold question for you. The first is kind of following up on what Lori and Wendy said. How, from a funder's perspective, how do you look at funding decisions during a strategic restructuring exploration and then after it's decided upon and is being implemented, especially if both organizations receive funding from your foundation? And then the second part of my question is a more macro question, just in general about especially in the private foundation world, how is strategic restructuring being viewed these days, especially kind of in our COVID world now? Do you think, is it being encouraged more, supported more? So kind of that I guess that more specific question first, and then a more macro kind of climate question.
Yeah, you know, I can speak specifically a little bit about Ahmanson and the way that it does its grant making. You know, we're a responsive grant maker, and so we ask organizations to come to us for what it is that they need, and we want to understand sort of what the full costs are for something like that. And so we would not like preclude an organization if they have merged from, you know, we wouldn't say, you know, we won't give you this, we will give you this. You know, really for us, it's what is it that you need? Let's have the conversation so that we can understand and then make an informed decision sort of around what we would be willing to look at. In terms of other funders, I think there's been a lot of interest in the funding community in NSI, especially as it relates to COVID. I think the concept of strategic restructuring is starting to normalize, and I think NSI and there are other organizations that are similar locally. You know, this is a big part of the work. So for us, it's about normalizing the concept of strategic restructuring across the funding community. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 18 foundations that participate in NSI. And so we're regularly having conversations about this, doing our best to sort of normalize amongst each other, and then also sort of broader to the other community. And so all different types of organizations can participate in NSI, whether or not they're funded. There's still a lot of learning that can take place. I think, you know, I think this is really important, and it's been said before, but I think a lot of the importance of NSI is in nurturing those trusting relationships that organizations can be comfortable going to funders early on. And so the hope is that if funders are brought into the process, they're invested in the outcome, and then they'd be more likely and more inclined to support the full cost of the resulting entity in whatever sort of configuration that is. I say that, but of course, every funder operates individually outside of the pooled fund, and they're beholden to their own grant-making guidelines and interests. And at the very least, it's important for organizations to talk to their funders, you know, early on, so that they get a better sense. If a funder feels very strongly in one direction, they'll have an understanding of how that will impact their bottom line, so that they can plan for it. But really for NSI, it's about normalizing it so that funders are more comfortable in this space. And that, I think, has been an evolution at the Ahmanson Foundation. And I think that it's been an evolution with many of our peers. I am disappointed to hear that, you know, in both cases, funders are discouraged, or funders are hesitant, or funders leave. I think that's certainly not something that we want to happen. So, you know, a lot of the field building for us is around sort of normalizing this as a process so that funders can support organizations for their true needs. Thank you,
Sarah. Yeah, and that work around, as you say, normalizing strategic restructuring, it is so important. So it's not seen as this stigma, or, you know, it's not associated with failure of for some reason. It really is, you know, an evolution, and can be a really sound, good strategic decision for organizations. So lots of good work happening there. So the next topic I'd like us to chat about, I would say, is the second most commonly asked question, at least in Vision. It's around board of directors engagement during this process. And we frequently see these conversations starting at the kind of chief executive to chief executive level, having kind of, you know, knowing each other, maybe having some past experience together, having some initial conversations, and then boards getting involved. Although sometimes we've seen situations where sometimes it's board chair to board chair, or chief executive and board chair to chief executive and board chair. But usually, it typically does start at the senior executive level. So then the question we are often asked is, how do we engage our board in this? We know it's going to be a long process. How do we help to educate them about the other organization? How do we bring them along so they have the information they need to make a good decision, but, you know, not overburden them with information or meetings, or, you know, just how do we engage them productively and help them to come along? And then once a decision is made, help them to really be on board supporting the integration efforts. And, you know, there's no single answer to that question. There's a lot of different things involved, but I know Lori and Wendy, from our previous conversations, you had some kind of good examples of how you were able to engage your boards throughout the process. So Wendy, maybe we could start with you on this question.
Yeah, and again, I do think it's so important because if your board is not behind this, you know, it's a non-starter. You know, Lori had mentioned about strategic planning. You know, if it's not in your strategic plan now, you know, it should be. Whether you use it or not, it at least gives you the ability to kind of go on record that this is something that you're exploring. So, you know, from the get-go, our board knew that this was something that we would just be keeping our eyes out for. We're not going out trying to court people, but, you know, we're here and we're thinking about it. And then the board nominated its own committee to kind of be, and we call it our business affairs committee for lack of a better term, and you know, these were three people that had experience in our prior merger, who had some level of understanding about what it's like and what you're going to need. And then our board felt comfortable with the three of them. And so, you know, in our new experience where we're just starting the conversation with another agency, you know, we had our delegation. And so, yes, the CEO and I have met. We talked about, you know, all sorts of things. We had another meeting where we said, okay, let's be real. What's really going on? And then our third meeting was with delegations from each board member, each boards, and got together and had the same kind of conversations that the CEO had. So, you know, again, I think, you know, because at some point the board is going to have to vote and they're going to have to get behind this. And I think that is so important. And part of what in this new conversation, the two delegations said was, are we going to combine boards? You know, what's that going to look like? Because it not only affects, you know, the agency and our day-to-day operations, but it truly affects the board. Are they a give-get board? You know, will that be a new expectation? What's that's going to look like? So, yeah.
Thanks. Lori, what have you experienced with your board and with the FEO board as well?
So we started with a task force on both boards had a task force, and they would meet separately as well as together. And I think that was a really good idea, bringing them together. And then we did make it, I think going forward, if I were to do this again, I would make it even more a topic at every board meeting. I think sometimes because it was dragging on, it was kind of like, well, there wasn't a lot of new to report, but I think it's important to keep it top of mind and keep coming back to those goals that you said at the beginning and how it ties back to your strategic objectives, because we did have a couple of board members that were not really on board with it. They thought this was a distraction. They thought it was going to take too much of my time. You know, why are we doing it? And I will say in the end, we did lose one board member that I don't think this was the only reason, but this person really wasn't in favor of it. So I think you just have to kind of know that that could happen just like with any key initiative. You know, I think a lot of, especially corporate board members that have corporate lives or past corporate lives, mergers have a lot of emotion tied to them. I guess I've never been in the corporate world, but from what I hear, it's, you know, it can be a bloodbath and it can be a very different experience. And I think they bring that in with them. So, you know, in our case, we weren't able to get past that. And I think she felt it would take away from another core program that we have. So I think those are the, you know, the key things that at least that we tried to do. And I think I'll need to even do that going forward, you know, starting with our first board meeting in September. We're bringing 3 of their board members on. That's what the final agreement was. We're doing, you know, onboarding them just like everyone else. We went through the same nominating process with them. I think there were 6 or 7 in the beginning that were interested in the board or a committee. And so we brought them all through the same process that we normally do. And, you know, we talked about our give or get, we talked about all of our expectations. And so they were coming on just like everyone else. There was no, well, we made an exception because of the merger. So I think that was helpful. There were a couple people that we decided together with them, they're better on a committee. A couple we put on our honorary board because they were like longtime board members, but it was like a overlap with the expertise and contacts that we already had. So, but I think going forward, now we're bringing those people on through the same board orientation process that we do with any other new board member. And I think I have to remember at the first board meeting going forward, keep talking about the merger and, you know, bringing it back to are we being true to those goals and what we set out to do? So that's the plan. But yeah, I think that's what I learned from it.
That's great. One of my big learnings from that your description, Lori, is having the other organizations board members going through that same vetting process and an orientation process. Yeah, it really gives that kind of consistency of experience for everyone. It feels very fair. So we'll come back to you in a couple years and we'll want to hear that. But I think that's a tidbit from that experience you've gone through. Sara, anything else you've seen work well, or any best practices you've seen in terms of board engagement during strategic restructuring?
Yeah, I would share that board engagement and availability is one of the most commonly reported challenges in pursuing strategic restructuring. But also, after having gone through the process, NSI grantees report that they have increased board engagement as a result of the process. So it can be a little bit of pain in the beginning, but then the payoff is there, which is nice. And since NSI has learned that board engagement is a predictor of success, we actually require a board resolution from each participating organization at the onset of the negotiation to ensure that the board is aware of the conversation and plans to participate. So we have learned that through the years that this is really important to the success.
It's so interesting that it's one of the biggest challenges, and you also hear that it's one of the big wins too. Yeah, that speaks to the learning and growth that can happen for organizations through the process. It's really cool. So my next question is, we talked about board. Obviously, we have to talk about staff in this conversation as well. And Wendy and Lori, particularly because you are large organizations, you have a lot of staff. And the organizations that you merged with were smaller in terms of staff, but still had staff. And so I'd like to hear from you suggestions you have for managing communication with staff, managing the transition with staff. It's not easy. This is definitely an area where we hear there's often a lot of fears from staff about about job security, about what's going to happen to the organization. So how have you managed that? And do you have any suggestions for other organizations? Lori, why don't we start with you for this one?
Sure. So yeah, I think one of the keys was getting your speaking points down, like having a clear communication plan of who's going to find out in what order and what the key messages are, which are a little bit different for staff versus donors and other stakeholders. So with staff, we did it, we rolled it out where the management team on both sides found out first, but then we engaged them in terms of how did they think we should, and we kind of had it in our mind, but get their input, how should we communicate it to their teams? And then we did that immediately, so that you don't have that lag of some people knowing and some people not. Part of the grant, we were able to do a short little video where the other CEO and I talked about what we saw the benefits being. It showed both of our programs, so that because our organization doesn't do manufacturing, wanted them to see that. They don't have a summer camp, they don't have after school programs, so they could see more of what we do. We use that for other stakeholders too. And then we did, as much as possible in-person meetings, and it got to be a very extended time frame because when we announced it versus when it's actually happening, but we've tried to kind of keep that going. We had some plans to move some of our staff into their building as soon as possible so that the whole team would come together. Of course, that now hasn't happened because of COVID, but we are getting the building ready. So when we're able to come back, it's kind of rebranded with AbilityFirst. And, we just want to make sure that that it's seen as AbilityFirst. And one thing I'm being really careful about is making sure we don't call it the FBO building. It's our supported employment office. It's about the program that's delivered there. Or you could say the Fair Oaks office, but not that we don't want to ever say FBO again, because we do. We're putting a great plaque on it to honor their legacy, and we'll be mentioning them in our marketing materials. But I just don't want it to be set up of, oh, well, that's where the manufacturing is, and that's them, and this is us. So that's why we're moving our other employment program in there as well. So, so that's how we're approaching it.
That's great. So much of it is about the communications and how it's handled. And you're right, like small things like just the shorthand of calling it the FBO building, that just sends a message, you know, of that them versus us. So it's so great to hear you're from the beginning, thinking about that. Wendy, what has your experience been with this transition with staff and communications?
Well, I think Lori did a great job. The only thing I would add is we right away shared salary scales and job descriptions and organizational charts so that they could, envision themselves within our organization. Because, let's be honest, at the end of the day, it does come down to, will I still have a job and what will I be making and what will my job title be? They kept their seniority. So, if they had been with this organization for 10, 15 years, they came to us with that same seniority, which, I think helped them with accruing, paid time off, their benefits and all of those kinds of things. We also kept them on with their own doctors and dentists, for a certain amount of time, so they would have that normalcy. And, as Lori kind of talked about with her board and bringing on new board members, we kind of had everybody go through orientation with us again so that they could really learn our culture and whatnot. 7 years later, we still have, I would say, close to 10 people, and they had an organization of maybe 75. And those 10 are solid, awesome employees, particularly in our fiscal department. So, yeah.
Great. Sarah, similar question. Anything you've seen in terms of lessons learned from other organizations on staff transition?
Yeah, again, this is a challenge that's commonly reported, particularly around communicating the process to staff and navigating sort of staff concerns. But on the other side, after having gone through the process, grantees report that there's greater internal clarity and strategic direction. There's a broader understanding sort of the financial situation of the organizations. There's greater employee engagement. They expand sort of their fundraising capabilities. There's an openness to future partnerships. And they even report that that staff and others sort of believe that they have an enhanced external reputation as part of it, which is nice to see. In terms of staff engagement, I think it's really important to consider some of the following questions. Who on staff is aware of the conversation? Who will be participating in the process? When do you plan to inform the other staff? And how do you anticipate that potential agreement will impact staff? We recognize that leaders of organizations don't want to bring all the staff into the conversation before they know the outcome, what it would be and how it might impact staff. And Lori and Wendy spoke to this. We've also heard from a lot of leaders, though, after the fact, they wish that they'd brought staff into the conversation sooner. This is something that every leader needs to determine for themselves based on sort of what the process will look like for them and what sort of strategic restructuring agreement they're looking to enter. This is why we really recommend that organizations and leaders reach out to someone who has gone through the strategic restructuring process to sort of talk through, help guide them in their decision. We can all learn from everyone's, successes and perhaps areas of opportunity. And so this is a great opportunity to connect with other people who've been through the process and learn from them what worked well.
Great. Well, my last question before we have some questions from our participants is just any other nuggets of wisdom, suggestions, particularly, I know we have some organizations on the call today who are thinking about or in the very early stages of considering a strategic restructuring. So any tips or suggestions we haven't talked about so far that you would give to these organizations? And Wendy, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay.
So I would say, and we've talked a lot about the communication, the transparency, which of course are important, but I would say always enter into conversations from a place of strength. I don't care what agency, if they're going through financial troubles or whatever, there is something that you can offer. And I would start with saying, look, we've got a great name. we've got a very strong HR director, we've got land, whatever it is. I think negotiating from a place of strength is huge. Part of that too is, what are your non-negotiables, and be clear about those up front. Yeah, I want to hold on to my name. Don't want to lose the name. Or yeah, I think we need a whole new board. Whatever it's going to be, I think saying that up front, and even if it's a hard conversation, doing that is going to save a lot of headache towards the end. And then the last thing I would talk about is the headache. There is going to be some point in the whole process where you want to throw your hands up and say, this ain't worth it. This is not worth the stress. This is not worth it. I know I was at that point, and we about called the deal off. That's why a consultant is so important, because you really, in this situation, do not want to make a decision based on emotion, frustration, anger, or some hiccup that you did not see. So rely on your consultant to be objective. And then Lori said the last thing, which I think is so important, is you as an agency, you have to really sit back and do a self-assessment. Why are we doing this? Are we doing this to really help kids and families, or am I doing this because of my ego? Or am I doing this because we need to be bailed out? So you got to be super clear about where you're coming from as an agency.
So great. Lori, anything else you'd want to add?
Yeah, I was laughing when Wendy talked about the role of the consultant, because I was going to say definitely that would be one of the number one things. But yeah, Allison from Envision walked me off more than one ledge during the time. So, yeah, because there will be time when you find out something new and you're like, what? But it's great because they're impartial and they can kind of go back and forth between the two organizations and I don't know if you can call it mediate, but really kind of help share the story in a different way, and as you said, take some of the emotion out of it and remind you why you're doing it. So I think that's really important, plus just that resource of the time that they have and the expertise that they have to delve into it and look at it in a different way than you and your staff probably won't be able to do. And then the second is time. Just like I said, ours took 2 years. I think going in, we thought it would be a year. So just, I guess they say double whatever you think it's going to be, and take your time and do it right. And then lastly, in addition to the consultant, is pro bono legal help, which was really, really important for us. And I think the NSI for making the introduction to public counsel for us. And we both got top-notch legal firms on both sides, and they did due diligence on top of what Envision had done and what we had done, and discovered even other things that I think will make it so much easier down the road, that we won't be finding things later that they found, related. These are both really old organizations, and the building that they have has been around a long time. So, you just have to find, there's a lot of things to be found if you know where to dig, and would have been incredible. It would have been cost prohibitive for us to hire a firm at the level and the time that they devoted. So that's another really, really key, I would say.
Sara, any final words of wisdom?
I have a lot of words of wisdom that I'd love to share, because we've been collecting a lot of data on the project. We actually have an FAQ document that I'd be happy to share with everyone after the webinar. We're also going to be putting it up on our website. So that's an opportunity. And then I would say, after you've, looked at the FAQ, if you still have questions, or you think that, you want to apply for funding, our project manager, Carrie Harlow, is available. She's a real person, and she will give you real-time sort of thoughts and feedback and guidance. And she's been working on this for many years. So she's an excellent resource, and happy to talk to organizations that are interested in this space.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we have one question, and it's for Sara. And this question is from Scott. He said, have there been any mergers which went through the process, including funding, when the merger falls through and the organizations close? What lessons were learned, and how maybe have funders adjusted from those experiences? I
can't think of anything specifically. I think that's part of it is I'm relatively new in terms of my managing funder role. So I've been involved in NSI for 7 years now, but I've only recently started reviewing the grants. This might actually be a better question for Carrie.
Yeah, and
but I guess I would I would say, oh, go ahead, Carrie.
I was just going to say, I also cannot think of an example where an agreement wasn't reached and the outcome was that one of the organizations folded as a result. I mean, certainly there have been some examples where organizations have gone through the process and come to a decision that it wasn't in their best interest to pursue an agreement, which is perfectly acceptable and sometimes the best possible outcome, right? That they determine that before they get into a committed relationship. So I think, but I can't think of any example where the organization has closed as a result. And that actually, Sarah can maybe speak to this, but we see this strategic tool as a strengths-based tool, and not, not best used when organizations are coming to the conversation from a position of, financial crisis. That oftentimes that's too late for them to even be an appropriate partner to be at the negotiation table. So I think that maybe helps address that.
Yeah, and I would thank you so much, Carrie. And I would also add that dissolution and the very difficult decisions that go along with that, and transferring remaining assets, and how a board goes through all of that. I mean, that is a separate process. It is something that I think we're all aware happens in the nonprofit world, and unfortunately, we might see more of that in the coming times, depending what happens with the economy. It is kind of a separate conversation, but some of the questions around continuing vision and mission and filling gaps in community and how you can keep a legacy going, and some of the strategic questions have some similarities, but this actual strategic restructuring process is definitely a different one. I'm looking at our questions. A question about timing. So this is also directed at Sarah, and Carrie, if you have perspective, please weigh in. Like average time from start to finish, knowing that Lori mentioned 2 years. I would just say we have seen kind of wide range of timing, but definitely 18 months to 2 years is typical of what Envision has seen. Sarah or Carrie, any other thoughts on timing?
No, that's correct. And I think it's really going to depend on whether or not you're doing a full sort of merger of an organization, or if perhaps you're doing sort of a back office consolidation. It's going to depend on the complexity of the organization. If there's, in some cases, there's a lot of real estate, and what does that mean? I think it depends on so many different factors, but I think you're right. I think on average, that's sort of where it's going.
And then we are just right at time. We have one last question though. What role or interface with board chairs or board members has been most beneficial, as getting their true support is crucial? Board egos can be masked, time can be lost in getting true feelings on the table. It's a big question. I think from what we've seen, working through a task force of board members who really have the time, are committed, perhaps have some experience with restructuring, even in the corporate world, kind of understand the process, is helpful because they can be good liaisons back to the full board. We've also seen, this sounds fluffy, but it really is true. Boards getting to know each other is really important. It is, I mean, a lot of it is the due diligence paperwork and the nuts and bolts, but the human side is important too. And before March, when we could have a happy hour with 2 boards getting together and getting to know each other, it really helped a lot. Now we're actually facilitating some Zoom happy hours between boards that are having these conversations, just to kind of have the chemistry and get to know each other, understanding as human beings, not just organizations on paper. We are right at time, so I'm going to respect everyone's time. And Rosie, if you could put up that last slide that we have with resources, we will wrap it up. And as we're getting the slide up there, just true thanks to our speakers today, Wendy, Lori, Sarah, Carrie, thank you so much for your time. Just your insights are invaluable for everybody. We will be sharing the recording from today with all the participants, and as well as these resources. We've talked about NSI. Sarah mentioned the Sustained Collaboration Network. That's a national group of funders in different geographies. I know we have some folks on the line from outside Southern California. There are some other funding collaboratives that support this work in other places, and you can go to that website to find them. Thank you all again for sharing your experience. Thank you for everyone for participating, and we look forward to continuing this conversation going forward. Have a good day, everyone.